I'm Alex.
And I'm Dani.
And we're seriously nerdy
about mid-century Mars. And we're also seriously nerdy about scratch bashing. Scratch bashing, if you've never heard of it, is the concept of taking found objects like junk in your junk drawer, bits and pieces from around your home, and turning them into an original creation. It's sort of like kit bashing, but instead of using model kits, you use found objects. It works really well for a build like this because we're able to take stuff we have around our apartment and turn it into this new concept for mid-century Mars. This is our second video in a series that we're calling Mid-Century Mars, and it's a concept that imagines if Earth had banded together and instead of fighting World War II, worked to get humankind to Mars, what that might look like. So it's taking model kits intended for World War II and instead placing them in a Martian landscape. For this build, we were inspired by the idea of World War II victory gardens and what those might look like if we had settled on Mars. So we started with the base, basically a Martian landscape with a few planters, and the planters will hold vegetation that can grow native to Mars. But we're also going to do a vertical hydroponic capsule that will grow Earth vegetables that only require the sun from Mars, but cannot thrive without oxygen.
For our science nerds out there, it's worth noting that for our mid-century Martian builds, we've decided to go with bubble helmets and assume that our humans can survive on the surface otherwise.
We decided that our victory garden would be inspired by the vegetables that were popular in the 1940s and 50s. So there are mustard greens and beets and cabbage and carrots. And in order to create the leaves for those plants, I painted strips of paint on craft paper and then cut them out using the Glowforge. It creates this really lovely natural texture that gives enough differentiation among the leaves, and they look a little more lifelike. I mean, I say lifelike, but I'm about to make blue Martian carrots, so take that with a grain of salt. Now, we're still establishing the rules of the world for our mid-century Mars, but we liked the idea that residents maybe have these victory gardens around their properties as a way of getting fresh fruits and vegetables, even when they're miles and miles from Earth.
Our approach to preparing fruits and vegetables was inspired by Seb Makes Stuff. We'll link to his video in the description.
If you've ever visited Epcot at Walt Disney World, you may be familiar with Livin' with the Land. It's a hydroponic showcase attraction that was very popular for my family when we would visit Disney World. And I love the idea of bringing a hydroponic garden in a tiny, tiny scale and working at 1/35 scale and getting to think through how the water would reach the roots and how they would fit in this space. I am no scientist or hydroponic gardener, but it was a really fun thought experiment as a maker. Ranking these vegetables in order of difficulty, this cherry tomato plant is arguably the hardest. It's got very, very delicate tiny leaves, and I had to think through how to make tiny cherry tomatoes, so I ended up relying on these glass beads with a little bit of ink to dye them various colors of cherry tomato red. Overall, so tiny, just a lesson in patience. I think maybe I'm more suited for mustard green life, maybe a beet, but cherry tomatoes are a special occasion build for sure.
We used these same glass beads to make our crystalline succulents in our last Martian build, so I have a feeling we'll be experimenting with them more. They're really fun to work with.
The capsule that's going to hold all of our hydroponic plants vertically used to be a bead container that we are upcycling, so I needed to create rigging that could run up inside the clear bead capsule and showcase the vegetables as well as their exposed roots in order to convey the concept that this is a hydroponic garden. For the roots, we're using a spongy white moss called Evans deer moss, and it naturally breaks itself into these tree-like structures, which work beautifully for roots. With a little bit of paint, depending on the vegetable variety, they make perfect and very easy roots. Switching gears to our Martian varieties of vegetables, I used green stuff with a little pinprick at the top to create blue Martian carrots that I can push into the soil and they kind of hold their shape. For the Martian squash, I actually ended up using the dried buds from eucalyptus that I had in a bouquet. They just look like little summer squash already, and with a coat of paint, have that weird organic shape. And then I 3D printed some leaves for squash that I ended up making a mold out of so that I could try my hand at clear resin leaves. I thought the idea that maybe they'd had a hybrid squash variety and that the squash itself was sort of like earth squash, but the growing process, the leaves were holding on to water in a weird way, so they looked really crystalline, was interesting and not in any way based in science. So if you are a botanist, I am so sorry to have disappointed you, but we're just having fun here, imagining what vegetables could look like in a fantasy version of Mars. I'm so sorry, Mark Watney. Please don't come for me, Matt Damon. For the Martian soil in the planters, I'm trying something I've never tried before, but I've seen other YouTubers use, which is mixing baking soda into paint. I was very skeptical, and I'll be honest, I don't hate it. The paint stayed wet long enough for me to kind of root my vegetables in, and it dried hard enough to keep the vegetables in place, which is a big win in my book, because I didn't have to worry about glue spillover. They really look rooted in the soil.
If you're looking for a place to find some new interesting items for scratch bashing, we recommend checking out your local IKEA's As Is section. We found a lot of fun little doodads in there at a discounted rate.
Maybe my most favorite part of this build is that we're taking a World War II model kit from the 1980s, and we're going to turn it into a Nan-E robot. So we're basically taking what was supposed to be instruments of tiny war, and we're turning them into something that's nurturing and wholesome. And I love that. So I basically looked for pieces that I had two of in order to create symmetry for the robot, glued them together, and created Nan-E. Nan-E is a helper robot that's very common in households in mid-century Mars. It's not uncommon to see Nan-E bots helping with childcare or preparing dinner, or in this case, helping with gardening.
For the paint job on Nan-E, we used an airbrush metallic blue paint. Then we went in with Nuln oil to give that shading, and then we used highlights with silver to bring back some of that tarnish on the edges. And since Nan-E is in the middle of a vegetable gardening routine, we gave it a little styrene crate to hold its vegetables. And because we didn't want Nan-E to be lonely, we also made a tiny girl to inhabit this Martian landscape. This is Patricia, a young Martian settler. Her family came to Mars to explore Martian cuisine and open a Mexican-Martian fusion restaurant. There aren't that many little girls in Patricia's colony, so she spends a lot of time with Nan-E, helping with the gardening or just wandering the landscape, drawing in the untouched Martian soil. For the color scheme for Patricia's clothing, we matched similar colors that we used in our last Martian build to try to maximize the contrast against the Martian soil. So we used the same jade green for her leggings, and then a nice blue for her top. We gave her white sneakers, which seems kind of silly for Mars since they're undoubtedly going to be caked with Martian dust all of the time. And then we gave her that signature white and orange backpack. And last but not least, we put a Martian carrot in her hand so she can help out Nan-E.
We tried to follow a lot of the same cues that we used in our first mid-century Martian build, which is these backpack units that hold oxygen and these very simple bubble helmets to supply air. It's a very idyllic and simplified version of what Mars could have looked like, but it makes for a really beautiful build. And like our first build, we tried to take a lot of the same cues in figuring out how to distress in a way that is still visually appealing, but also realistic. So a little bit of dirt and dust here and there helps bring it to life. After a quick coat of paint on the base, I glued the Martian garden into place and prepared for the figures. This included putting our little oxygen filtration topper on our hydroponic garden, creating a couple organic shadows in the terrain, and gluing down our little girl and our Nan-E bot. After that, all that was left to do was paint the sides of the diorama with black 3.0 to hide those edges, and the rest is mid-century Martian history.